The lights of the Los Angeles studio blazed down on a packed audience, their murmurs buzzing like static. Electricity on the evening of March 2nd, 2025. It was a night millions had marked on their calendars. Morgan Freeman, the 87-year-old Hollywood legend, was stepping onto the set of Heart to Heart, a live talk show known for its bold host and unpredictable twists. The air was thick with anticipation as every seat in the house was filled, and countless viewers tuned in from their living rooms across the globe. Morgan Freeman, a man whose voice had narrated documentaries, played God, and soothed generations, was about to take center stage. Morgan emerged from the wings, his pace deliberate, his gray suit impeccable. The deep timbre of his voice greeted the crowd with a simple, "Good evening, my friends," and the room erupted. Applause thundered, some fans rising to their feet, others wiping tears from their eyes. At 87, he carried himself with the same poise that had defined his decades-long career, sharp, composed, and timeless. His presence alone was a promise of wisdom, a quiet assurance that tonight would be special. But the host, Lucas Hart, had other plans. At 32, Lucas was the rising star of late-night television, known for his brash charisma and a reputation for pushing guests out of their comfort zones. His gelled hair gleamed under the lights, and a smirk played on his lips as he watched Morgan settle into the plush chair across from him. Lucas leaned forward, tapping his pen against his knee, his eyes glinting with mischief. The audience hushed, sensing the shift. Morgan had come expecting a thoughtful exchange, perhaps about his latest film or reflections on a storied life. But Lucas Hart was not one for sentimentality. "So, Morgan," Lucas began, his voice slick and teasing, "you're 87 now. Don't you ever think you're a little past your prime for all this?" He gestured broadly at the studio, as if the very act of Morgan being there was an anomaly. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Smiles faded, replaced by furrowed brows. Morgan didn't flinch. He folded his hands in his lap, his gaze steady, and tilted his head ever so slightly, as if studying Lucas like a curious specimen. "Past my prime?" Morgan echoed, his tone calm but edged with amusement. "Tell me, Lucas, do you think time disqualifies experience or enhances it?" The question hung in the air, simple yet piercing. Lucas blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered with a chuckle. "Oh, come on, Morgan. Hollywood loves fresh faces. You don't feel a bit out of place?" Morgan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Out of place? No, son. I think the folks here would disagree with you." He nodded toward the audience, who erupted in cheers, their claps a defiant rebuttal. Lucas's smirk faltered. The night had just begun, and already, Morgan Freeman was rewriting the script. Lucas leaned back in his chair, undeterred, though a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He wasn't used to guests turning his questions back on him, especially not with such effortless grace. Tapping his pen faster, he decided to dig deeper. "All right, Morgan, let's get real," he said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. "You grew up dirt poor in Mississippi, right? Dad walked out. Mom scrubbed floors for a living. Ever feel like life dealt you a bad hand?" The studio fell silent, the weight of the question settling like dust after an explosion. A woman in the front row clutched her purse, her eyes wide. Another man shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his neighbor. Lucas's words weren't just bold. They were invasive, a jab at a past Morgan rarely discussed publicly. But the man across from him didn't waver. Morgan exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing together in a familiar gesture of contemplation. "A bad hand?" he repeated, his voice soft but resonant. "No, Lucas, I wouldn't call it that. Life doesn't deal hands, it builds character." He paused, letting the words sink in, then leaned forward slightly. "My father left, yes. But you know what he gave me by leaving? A blueprint of the man I'd never become. And my mother, she didn't just scrub floors. She built a home, a life, and a son who'd never forget her strength. That's not a bad hand. That's a foundation. The audience stirred, a murmur of awe rippling through the seats. A young woman in the back row dabbed her eyes with her sleeve, nodding as if Morgan's words had struck a chord deep within her. Lucas, however, pressed on, unwilling to let the moment slip. Sure, that's a nice spin, he said, waving a hand dismissively. But let's talk about now. You're 87. Don't you ever wake up thinking, well, this might be it? The bluntness landed like a slap. Gasps echoed from the crowd, and a gray-haired man in the third row shook his head in disapproval. Lucas grinned, clearly reveling in the discomfort he'd sown. Morgan, though, remained a statue of calm. He met Lucas's gaze, his eyes deep pools of wisdom, and spoke with quiet conviction. Every morning I wake up, Lucas, I don't think about the end. I think about the gift. Another day to breathe, to laugh, to learn. Do you wake up counting your blessings or your fears? The question sliced through the room, sharp and unyielding. Lucas's grin faded, his fingers tightening around his pen. He opened his mouth to retort, but the audience's applause drowned him out, a wave of support crashing over his bravado. Morgan had turned a crude provocation into a lesson, and Lucas was starting to realize he'd underestimated his guest. Unfazed or perhaps too stubborn to back down, Lucas shifted tactics, his tone growing sharper. Okay, Morgan, you're good with words. I'll give you that, he said, his smirk returning. But let's talk about your career. You've played God, presidents, the wise old mentor. Now you're just, well, an old guy on my couch. Doesn't that feel like a step down? The audience inhaled collectively, the insult hanging heavy in the air. A teenage boy in the crowd winced, glancing at his mother, who mouthed, "That's too far." Lucas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, waiting for Morgan to crack. But Morgan didn't. He chuckled, a low, rich sound that rolled through the studio like distant thunder. "A step down?" he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Lucas, have you ever climbed a mountain?" Lucas frowned, thrown off by the metaphor. "What's that got to do with?" Morgan cut in, his voice steady. "When you reach the top, you don't look down and call it a fall. You look back at the climb, the view, the struggle, the beauty. I've told stories that moved people, made them think. Playing God wasn't the peak. Sitting here, still talking, still breathing, that's the climb. What's your mountain, Lucas? What have you built?" The room went still, the weight of Morgan's words pressing down on every soul present. A woman in a red dress clutched her husband's hand, her lips trembling. Lucas squirmed, his confidence unraveling. "I've built this show," he shot back, gesturing to the set. "Millions watch me every night." Morgan nodded, almost paternally. Millions watch. But what do they see? A man who lifts others up, or one who needs to push them down to feel tall? The audience erupted, cheers and claps blending into a roar. Lucas's jaw tightened, his ears reddening. He hadn't expected this, an 87-year-old, turning his own platform against him with nothing but calm, cutting truth. Desperate to regain control, Lucas pivoted. "Fine, let's talk legacy then," he said, his voice rising. "You've had your run, Morgan. When you're gone, what's left? A few movies? A voice people will forget?" It was a low blow, cold and final, and the crowd bristled. A man in a tweed jacket stood, ready to protest, but sat back down as Morgan raised a hand, signaling peace. "Forget?" Morgan said, his tone soft but unshakable. "Legacy isn't about being remembered, Lucas. It's about what you leave in people's hearts. I've told stories that made folks laugh, cry, think. That's not forgotten, it's carried. What will you leave, son? A laugh at someone's expense or a light in their dark?" The studio trembled with emotion. A woman sobbed quietly, her hands pressed to her face. Lucas stared at Morgan, his bravado crumbling, the pen in his hand now still. He'd thrown his best punches, and Morgan had caught everyone, turning them into something profound. Lucas's shoulders slumped, but his pride wouldn't let him surrender yet. He straightened, forcing a laugh. "You're full of wisdom, Morgan. I'll give you that," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "But aren't you ever afraid? I mean, 87 years time's ticking. Doesn't that scare you?" The question was raw, almost cruel, and the audience held its breath. Morgan leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled a warm, knowing smile that seemed to light the room. "Afraid?" he said. "Let me tell you something about fear, Lucas. Fear is a shadow. It only grows when you turn from the light. I don't look at the clock and tremble. I look at the day and ask, what can I do with it?" Lucas blinked, his smirk fading entirely. Morgan continued, his voice steady as a river. "I've seen fear in men's eyes, friends who didn't get 87 years. Children who didn't get 17. Fear doesn't own me, because I've chosen something stronger. Gratitude. What do you choose every day, Lucas?" The silence was deafening. A man in the back row wiped his eyes with a sleeve, his wife squeezing his arm. Lucas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. For the first time, he had no quip, no comeback. Morgan's words weren't just a response. They were a mirror, and Lucas didn't like what he saw. Sensing his host's retreat, Morgan pressed on gently. "You asked about my time running out. Let me ask you this. If your time ran out tomorrow, would you be proud of this moment? This show? These questions?" The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Lucas's hands trembled slightly, the papers on his lap rustling. I don't know," Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible. Morgan nodded, his gaze softening. "That's a start, son. Knowing you don't know, that's where wisdom begins." The audience broke into applause, not just for Morgan, but for the shift they felt unfolding. Lucas looked down, his bravado stripped bare, and something flickered in his eyes' vulnerability, perhaps even regret. Lucas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He was rattled, his usual swagger gone. "Okay, Morgan," he said, his tone quieter, almost reverent. "You've got me there. One last question, and I mean it this time. If you could tell the world one thing before you go, what would it be?" Morgan paused, his eyes drifting upward as if searching the heavens. Then he smiled, leaning toward Lucas. "Live every day like it's a chance to give something love, kindness, a laugh. That's what matters. Not the years, not the fame, just the giving." The room erupted, applause swelling like a tide. Lucas nodded slowly, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. I think I learned something tonight," he said finally, his voice cracking. Morgan reached over, patting his shoulder. "Good. Then this wasn't a waste." The crowd cheered louder, some standing, others weeping openly. Lucas forced a smile, but it was genuine this time, no smirk, no edge. Morgan had turned the battle into a lesson, and Lucas, for once, was the student. As the applause faded, Morgan rose from his chair, giving the audience a small wave. "Thank you, my friends," he said, his voice wrapping the room in warmth. "Go home tonight and call someone you love. Tell them they matter." The crowd stood as one, their claps following him as he exited the stage, a titan of grace and grit. Lucas sat alone under the lights, staring at the empty chair. The producers cut to commercial, but the moment lingered. Backstage, crew members whispered about what they'd witnessed, and interview turned reckoning. At home, viewers flooded social media, clips of Morgan's responses going viral within hours. "This is why he's a legend," one tweet read. "He didn't just answer, he taught." In the front row, a woman in her 60s clutched her husband's hand, tears streaking her face. "That's what my dad used to say," she whispered. "Live for love." Nearby, a young man typed furiously on his phone, texting his mother an apology he'd meant to send for years. Lucas, still on set, flipped through his notes absently. He'd come to provoke, to entertain, but left humbled. Morgan hadn't humiliated him. He'd offered a lifeline, a chance to rethink the man he'd become. "What will they remember about you?" Morgan had asked, and the question echoed in Lucas's mind long after the cameras stopped rolling. The next day, headlines blazed. Morgan Freeman silences rude host with wisdom and class. But it wasn't silence Morgan had sought, it was understanding. At 87, he'd faced a storm of rudeness and emerged not just victorious, but transformative. He'd reminded the world that true power lies not in tearing down, but in building up one calm, cutting word at a time. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of Los Angeles, Morgan Freeman sat by his window, watching the city glow. He smiled to himself, knowing he'd left a little more light behind. That, he thought, was enough.